Okay, good morning, everyone. And welcome back. So let's carry on with it yesterday. Just to remind you, we're looking at the two powers, the power of reflection and the power of development, which is all about meditation practice. I want to talk a little bit more now about the power of reflection, because that is what leads us to meditation. So, putting in all the right causes, so meditation sort of happens almost as a natural consequence of the factors of the path being in place already here. So we're going to talk about this, and know the great suttas that talk about this power of reflection to overcome hindrances and problems is called the paṭicca-samuppāda, two kinds of thoughts. And this is the number 19 sutta of the middle length saying of the Majjhima Nikaya. And this is one of these other great suttas, autobiographical suttas, where the Buddha talks about his own life, his own practice before his awakening, how he actually got all the way to the end of finding the solution to the problem of suffering and all of these kind of things. So it is to my mind, very interesting sutta. Obviously, what the Buddha is doing, he's telling us this is what he did, so we should do the same. And it's kind of nice. It kind of points out that we have the same nature as the Buddha. There isn't any fundamental difference. The practice is the same. He also, in a sense, practiced the Eightfold Path, except that he didn't really know what he was doing. He was kind of fumbling in the dark, trying to find this path. But eventually it turned out that he also had practiced the Eightfold Path, and otherwise he wouldn't have been able to reach this point of awakening. He did not practice the Bodhisattva path, and we shall see that in a second, what really happened there. So this is this sutta, and this here is Venerable Bodhi's translation. I'm not sure now why I sometimes have the one, sometimes I have the Bodhi. Probably gets a bit confusing because the terminology is a bit different, but never mind. That's kind of when you put together some suttas randomly, that's what happens sometimes, not really careful enough. So this is how it goes, this particular sutta, and that's how I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was living at Savatthi in Jeta's Grove, another Paṭicca's park, or really monastery is probably a better translation there. There he addressed the bhikkhus thus. Bhikkhus, Venerable Sir, they replied, and the Blessed One said this. So here we are in the famous Jeta Grove monastery, the Anathapindika's monastery. You will notice here the slight difference in translation. Sometimes it translates Anathapindika's park, or sometimes Anathapindika's monastery. So which one is right? Well, they're both right, actually, because what happened was that parks were usually given, or often given, to the monastics or to the Buddha to establish monasteries. So the park became monasteries. But in the suttas, usually this word arama, and actually is used in both ways. It's actually very hard to pin it down. So maybe what we need to do is to have a contextual translation. And this is one of the things that I have kind of found very important in my own translations of the Pali, is actually to translate contextually rather than having a rigid system, one-to-one system of translation. I think this is actually, it's harder to translate in some ways contextually. because it means that you have to take the context into account, and in similar context, of course, you have to be consistent in similar contexts. But when a context is quite different, you translate in a different way. And that makes the text more natural when you read it in English. If you have a very rigid one-to-one translation system, which Bhikkhu has a bit more of that than probably others, or some others anyway, and then sometimes it can become a bit awkward. But I have to admit though that Bhikkhu translations are usually very smooth and very beautiful. Anyway, I don't know why I'm getting into this. It's probably a bit on the technical side. But so they are there. So then we're at the monastery. And then the Buddha says the following. Bhikkhus, before my awakening, while I was still only an unawakened bodhisattva, it occurred to me, suppose I divide my thoughts into two classes. Let me just stop there, because there's a lot of information already there in the very first part there. So here the Buddha is talking about his time before his awakening. And yeah, you will notice that I read this as awakening rather than enlightenment. Which one is correct? Well, in terms of the actual meaning of the Pali word Samboda, it is closer to awakening than to enlightenment. Buddha means to awake to something. And it is still found in some languages in the present day. These are all part of the same language group, the Indo-European languages. And in some of these Indo-European languages, you say Buddha means you wake up in the morning. I'm Buddha. It's the easy way to awakening, right? You wake up in the morning, okay, Buddha. And Russian apparently uses that word like that. We don't have any Russian speakers here. What about, you speak Russian at all? No? Okay. Oh, really? Okay. Yeah, okay, all right. So, but anyway, what about some of the Polish friends? Do you speak Russian at all? Do you have any Russian speakers? No? Okay. Okay. Oh, well, let's try again. That's what I have been told. I don't speak Russian myself, but that's what I've been told by Russian speakers. So it's actually very close, that meaning, and it still has that meaning in some of the languages that are related to Pali and related to Sanskrit. One of the very interesting things about these languages is that they're all part of what is known as the Indo-European language group. It's a very, very large language group, and it stretches all the way from India and all the way across to almost all over Europe. There are a few languages in Europe that are not Indo-European. Hungarian, Estonian, Estonian is not Indo-European, Finnish, and Basque language also is a completely different thing. No one knows what Basque is all about. But so these so it's kind of interesting, yeah. All of these languages are related. So if you read this Pali, you will see that there are similarities between Pali and English, Pali and French, Pali and Flemish, whatever it is that you speak, or German or whatever. There's a number of similarities, especially basic words like counting words or words of family relations, mother and father, these things, they're across the board, almost exactly the same. So for that reason, I think awakening is quite nice, but it is also true that the idea of awakening is often symbolized by light in the suttas. Yeah, the light goes on, the darkness is dispelled. It's a very common symbolism and a simile for what awakening is about. So in that sense, enlightenment is also kind of work, so the light goes on. But I don't know, personally, I feel the word enlightenment has too much baggage, and I don't really kind of favor it for that reason. I prefer awakening myself. To me, awakening is more immediate and has a more kind of powerful symbolic idea. You awake to the truth. Wow, to me that works better. But I think it's probably a matter of taste sometimes. Anyway, before his awakening, the Buddha is talking, while I was still an unawakened bodhisattva. Isn't that interesting? The word bodhisattva is found there in the suttas, and it is found in a few places in the suttas in this way. And it is very often as here left untranslated, just as bodhisattva. And of course, if it is left untranslated like this, then you assume that it is the same thing as what is called the bodhisattva in the Sanskrit. Yeah? And the bodhisattva, of course, once you use that word bodhisattva, it implies the all developed bodhisattva ideal that is actually much later in Buddhism. That is kind of implied by that word. As soon as you read that word, you think that's what you think of. Yeah, it kind of brings the association with all the later development of Buddhism. It gets then drawn into the translation, although it should not, because these suttas are far, far earlier than the developed bodhisattva ideal as it came out during the centuries after the time of the Buddha. So what exactly does it, if it is not related to that, what does it mean in this particular context? It's kind of interesting. When you come across these little strange things in the sutta, it's always very fascinating, because there's always something to be learned from that, or something is funny and strange. What is going on here? And what is not going on is that this is actually a reference, or is the same, or is the embryonic form of the later bodhisattva ideal. That is not what is going on here. In the sutras, you find that the word bodhisattva is almost always used of the Buddha to be when he decided, or just after he decided to go forth. He decided to become a monk. He decided to shave off his hair and put on the old robes. Yeah, from that point on, he was a bodhisattva, according to the sutras. There are a couple of exceptions to that. There is in the a sutta called the Acharya Buddha Sutta, Majjhima 123. Acharya Buddha means something like the wonderful and the marvelous. It's all about the things that happened around the Buddha's to be's birth into this world. They're the kind of amazing thing that happened around that. And so in that is one of the very few places where bodhisattva is used of the Buddha, and from the very beginning of this coming into this existence, and even going back to his previous life just before that. But that sutta is it's a sutta which is not all that reliable. The reliability of suttas, you judge that by comparing suttas in different traditions. Yeah, this sutta exists in a number of ancient languages, like in ancient Chinese, or it's actually called Middle Chinese, and then in Pali. And then by comparing the suttas and seeing the amount of discrepancy, you can know the extent to which the suttas have been kind of kept intact over long periods of time. So that sutta is actually quite unreliable. So I don't really judge that to be very significant, the fact that it is out there. So, but the general consensus in the suttas is that this refers to the time after the Buddha went forth. That kind of makes sense, yeah? Because after the Buddha went forth, well, we know at that point he was searching for awakening. So then to call him a bodhisattva actually starts to make sense. Prior to that, he didn't know what he was doing. Prior to that, he was messing around in lay life, enjoying the Benares cloth and the kind of these three houses, the three prasadas, sometimes translated as palaces. It doesn't mean palace, it's a stilt house, quite literally. If you judge that word prasada, it actually refers to a stilt house, and they were built in ancient India. And so he was messing around, he didn't know what he was doing, and suddenly he decides, wow, there's a problem here, I need to go forth. Then he is a bodhisattva. If you look at some of the very interesting, there's a whole genre of suttas, a whole kind of type of Buddhist literature called the Jataka stories. You have heard of the Jataka stories, many of you. Very interesting, many of those Jatakas. Some of them are very fascinating stories, and they are supposed to be the stories of what happened to the Buddha to be in past lives, how the Bodhisattva practiced so that eventually to become a Buddha. That's kind of the Jataka story. Jataka means birth. It really means birth stories. And so these stories are, when you read them, some of them are very interesting and very funny, but some of them are also very non-Buddhist. It does things that have nothing to do with the Buddhist path, actually completely counter to the Buddhist path. Things that are really outrageous, like giving away his family to some nasty character, that kind of stuff. It's really, really strange things going on there. And these are kind of the Jataka collection. It's a very large collection. Yeah, it's kind of 5 volumes, large volumes of stories. Very nice to read, but don't take it too seriously because you might get led astray on the Buddhist path if you take those stories too seriously. Yeah. But what is interesting is that there are some Jataka stories that are found in the main Nikayas, in the main collection of what we consider the most ancient part of the Buddhist canon. Yeah. I haven't really spoken much about how to distinguish between the earliest suttas and the later ones. But basically, you can take that the earliest suttas are the 4, what is known as the 4 collections: long discourses, mid discourses, connected discourses, and numerical discourses. They are basically the ancient suttas. There's a bit of a variability within that collection, but that is a good kind of rule of thumb. And within that collection, you also find some Jataka stories. And these, if you want to have some authentic Jataka stories, well, you get much closer when you come to these suttas. And what you find there is very different. And what you find in these Jataka stories in the suttas are so different. They are like night and day compared to these other Jataka stories. And one of the famous ones is known as the Gatikara Sutta, which is, I think, Majjhima Nikaya 81, the 81st Sutta of the Middle Next Sayings. And in the Gatikara Sutta, the Buddha to me is the Buddha in the past life, right? His name is Jotipala. He's this kind of really arrogant Brahmin at that time. Yeah? And the Brahmins were the high-born people in India, so sometimes they were a bit arrogant because they kind of considered themselves better than anyone else. So he was this kind of Brahmin, and he had a friend. His friend was named Gatikara. And his friend Gatikara was a disciple of the previous Buddha. It was Buddha Kassapa, supposed to be the Buddha before Buddha Gautama. So the first question you might ask, was there a Buddha Kassapa? Is this just a mythology, or is it real, or what is going on? Well, the answer to that is that, remember, the arising of a Buddha in the world is just like a natural principle. Yeah? Buddhas arise every now and again, so there must have been past Buddhas. We are not kind of, Buddhism is very different from most religions in the sense that we don't happen to be the lucky people who kind of were born at the time when the Buddha arose in the world. Buddhas happen with regular intervals. These are natural principles, which is another thing which is very nice about Buddhism. There's nothing really special about our time. Yeah, as soon as you hear our time is really special, yeah, and we are so lucky because Jesus or whatever was born and we can get to hear his teaching, straight away I kind of turn off a little bit, because why should we be special, man? We're just people like everyone else. It doesn't really matter. Once you kind of bring in the ego, you are special, straight away there's something dodgy going on there. So in Buddhism, instead of having one savior that kind of comes along and, wow, you were lucky you're born at this time, no. Buddhas arise at regular intervals. There's nothing really special about our time. It's special enough that we are born at the time when Buddhism is still around. That is special enough. So yes, so was there Buddha Kassapa? Maybe there was Buddha Kassapa. There were certainly past Buddhas. And so Gatikara is a disciple of Buddha Kassapa, and he's a very almost fully enlightened. He's this extraordinary lay disciple. He's supposed to be a non-returner according to the Suttas, almost arahant. And so he thinks about his friend Jotipala. Jotipala, right, is the Buddha to be. Yeah, soon to become the Buddha in a couple of lifetimes down the line. And so he says to him, he says, come, let's go and visit the Buddha. Jotipala says, those shaven-headed ascetics, yeah, the kind of the offspring of Brahma's feet, kind of the low of the low. I don't want to see those dodgy characters. Something like that. Yeah, he says he uses words that are very pejorative words, like underdone, it's like kind of shaven-headed, shaveling is sometimes translated as a derogatory sense to it. And so, but Gatikara, he persists, yeah? He tries again and again to get Jotipala to go and see this Buddha, and eventually he grabs him by the hair to pull him there. Now, grabbing a Brahmin by the hair is a faux pas. You're not supposed to do that. Yeah, it's kind of a bad thing to do. These are go against the very cultural norms of ancient India. I think probably even contemporary India. We don't have any Indians here. Usually there's some Indians on these retreats that I can maybe next time we can ask, because sometimes very handy to have people from everywhere around the world and get these cultural questions out of the way straight away and get them sorted out there. So it goes against the kind of cultural accepted norms. Yeah, it is really considered wrong. And then Jotipala, because Gatikara is such a close friend, he said, wow, you dragged me, you kind of grabbed me by the hair. Jeepers, what is going on? This must be really serious. And then he starts to listen to his friend, because you realize if his friend is willing to do something that goes so much against the accepted norms of that society, there must be something important going on there. And then he goes to Buddha, then he listens to that paṭicca-samuppāda, and then he's kind of, wow, this is extraordinary. Yeah? But you see all the way through, he's not really practicing any path at all. He's not the bodhisattva, he's anti-Buddhist, if anything. Yeah, he's going in the opposite direction. He's really had it with these kind of samanas walking around India pretending to be enlightened or whatever. Yeah? Maybe they are enlightened, but he wouldn't want to hear anything about it. So that is the Buddha, and it goes against the whole bodhisattva idea of that. And there are a number of other sutras that kind of portray the Buddha to be in this way in past life. There is one very nice past life story in the sutras that maybe is the most authentic of all the past life sutras. This is called the paṭicca-samuppāda Sutta, and it's found in the Gutta Nikaya 3, number 15. And in this paṭicca-samuppāda Sutta, the Buddha to be is a wheelwright. A wheelwright means someone who makes wheels. And this is like, what is the cartwright? Either he makes car, I think he makes wheels. Yes, he makes wheels, that's right. Yeah. And this is like a very low profession, yeah, in the kind of Indian hierarchy of professions. You make wheels, kind of nobody, very, very bottom of the caste system in ancient India. Even. And that is already very interesting, that the Buddha to be is at a very low level. Usually he's kind of placed very high, even in the Jataka stories, it's put very highly. Yeah. So whenever you find something that goes against the grain, goes against the normal way things are presented, it often means it is more authentic, because no one would dare to say the Buddha to me was a wheelwright. Yeah? How can anyone dare to say such a thing? It's like putting down the Buddha. So that is a good reason to think maybe it is one of the criteria you can use to judge the authenticity of suttas. There was a very famous quote by Thomas T.W. Davis, Thomas, a very famous British translator who started the Pali Text Society and all these kind of things. He was very prominent. He was almost like a Buddhist, and he never really made the leap to say he was a Buddhist because it was too difficult in Victorian times to say that. It was back in the 1870s, 1880s, that sort of time. So where was I going with T.W. Davis? So what was I going to say about that? Anyway, so okay, just let it be. So this story in the Anguttara 3 is the paṭicca-samuppāda Sutta. Yeah, the Buddha to be such a simple person, kind of the lowest aspect. Yeah, that's what I was going to go with that. He said that because he was a lawyer. He was a very famous, was a barrister at that time, so lawyer at a high level. And he said that whenever evidence is presented that goes against the interest of the person who presents the evidence, it is more likely to be true. Yeah, so if I present evidence in a court of law, that evidence actually is against my interest, yeah, because if I say, then it is more likely to be true, because normally I don't want to present stuff which goes against my interest. So this is a very interesting principle, and this is a principle that can then be used also to judge authenticity of the suttas if it goes against the grain, against the general interest of the Buddhist community, if you like. So he's very, very simple person. He makes these wheels, yeah, and the king is about to go to war, so the king goes to his wheelmaker, the wheelwright, and asks, I need a new pair of wheels for my chariot. Everything is so tiny and small. It sounds like I had one chariot. I was going to go to war. It would have sounded like in this thing. Yeah. Everything is so tiny and small. It's kind of very interesting. Yeah. These little details are very interesting. It says something about an ancient society. Yeah. And so he makes his wheel. He makes one wheel, it takes him 6 months. And then he makes a second wheel, it takes him 6 days, right? Then the king asks him, how come it takes you 6 months to make one wheel and the next one in 6 days? And well, to make a wheel really, really well, you have to kind of untwist the wood and make sure you have exactly the right pieces of wood so the wood is completely uniform. So when you set the wood rolling, and then he shows the king, when you set the wheel rolling, it rolls, and when it comes to the end, it stands straight, it doesn't fall down. Whereas the wheel that he made in 6 days, well, he didn't have time because the war was coming. I don't know how you judge 6 months in advance there's going to be a war, but anyway, that's what happened in this case. And so he set it rolling, and because it hasn't been treated with the same kind of perfection, with straightening out the wood, getting out all the knots, making sure the wood is perfectly uniform, you roll it out, and when the momentum comes to an end, it falls over, and there's not a perfect wheel there. So this is another story of the Buddha. Yeah, he makes wheels for a war chariot for a king. There's no indication at all that he's a Buddhist. In fact, it gives exactly the opposite impression. He's just a menial worker, or maybe not menial, but he's an ordinary artisan or craftsman in some kind of ancient past. And it does things that are completely anti-Buddhist. Very, very simple life. But he had one thing, he was obviously an expert at what he was doing. That is maybe what shows you the beginning of the qualities of the Buddha in the future. And his ability to persevere, to do things in great detail, to make sure you do things really, really well. That kind of perfectionism may have been what kind of then enabled him to become a Buddha down the track. My point here is just to say that the whole Bodhisattva ideal, the ideal that someone practiced for 4 incalculable eons, he bowed down under the Buddha Dipankara as he was the ascetic Sumedha, according to the story, bowing down to the Buddha Dipankara, making the vow, I will become a Buddha in the future. All of that, there is no evidence at all in the suttas. In fact, all the evidence is counter to that. And it is very clear, I think, in the suttas, or clear from understanding the history of Buddhism, and what happened was that after the Buddha passed away, then these stories started to circulate, and gradually the whole Bodhisattva idea was built up around these kernels that you find, some of the seeds that you find in the early suttas. And they build up around that. If you want to read more about this, there's very interesting work done by Venerable Analayo. He has written some very interesting papers or books actually, on these things. And this is one book is called The Genesis of the Bodhisattva Ideal. I think that's what it's called, something like that anyway. And it gives a very kind of, to my mind, very realistic description, or shows the historical evolution of how this most likely happened, how the Bodhisattva ideal came to be. I think it's called The Genesis of the Bodhisattva Ideal. Yeah, something like that. So anyway, so if it does not mean the Bodhisattva here in an ordinary way, if it means the person who went forth in his very last life, then maybe the word itself has a different meaning. Maybe it doesn't mean Bodhisattva, enlightenment being or awakening being, which is a rather awkward construction anyway. Awakening being. It sounds a bit strange in English. Maybe it sounds strange in Sanskrit and Pali as well. I'm not sure. It's hard to judge sometimes. So what does it mean? And what it may mean, and this was pointed out by one of the great scholars of Sanskrit, Professor Richard Gombrich. He used to be the professor of Sanskrit at Oxford University in the UK, and he was professor there for over 30 years, and so he suggested that actually this word does not really mean awakening being at all. It means a being intent on awakening. Bodhi, intent on awakening. Because the word bodhisattva is a Pali word. It can be formed in different ways. It can relate to different words in Sanskrit. And how we understand it in the suttas will really depend on what the original intention was behind this word. And we can never really know that. We judge that by later developments. That's always dangerous. So because later developments have bodhisattva, we assume that that is the correct understanding, but actually it may not be that. So he argued strongly that this actually means intent on awakening. Yeah. So before my awakening, well, I was still only intent on awakening. Yeah? And this is how Paṭicca-samuppāda translates it in his latest translation of the suttas. And I think that brings out the more likely meaning of this whole phrase much better. It's nothing to do with a history like you later. It has to do with this very the way things were at the time of the Buddha himself. So yeah, so it is this person who is intent on awakening. It is this person who thinks, it occurred to me, suppose that I divide my thoughts into two classes. So anyway, I apologize for that if some of you found this utterly boring and incomprehensible or whatever. I don't know what to say except for, sometimes I need to kind of do a little bit of different things, and hopefully you got something out of that. But I think it is very interesting to have a little bit of a historical outlook when we look at these suttas, because it actually gets you closer to what the Buddha's real message is about. The Bodhisattva idea is a later idea that came later on. And the idea that we should practice as bodhisattvas in the present day, well, the Buddha didn't teach that. So if you want to be a disciple of the Buddha, you should not be a bodhisattva. You should be one who practices for awakening in an ordinary way. All right, so the Buddha said, suppose I divide my thoughts into two classes. Then I said on one side thoughts, or sensual thoughts, or sensory thoughts, angry thoughts, thoughts of ill will, angry thoughts, and thoughts of cruelty, or harmful thoughts, or harming thoughts, something like that. And I said on the other side, thoughts about renouncing, thoughts that are non-ill will, maybe metta, thoughts about non-harming, maybe compassion. And then he says, as I abided in this way, diligent, ardent, and resolute. Let's just stop there. So the first thing which is very interesting here, he says he abides diligent, ardent, and resolute. The Pali words here are appamada, atapi, and paṭicca. And appamada I discussed yesterday or the day before, I don't remember now. Kind of days merge all into one big block of days. But appamada is better translated as a heedfulness. You have to be heedful. Diligent is too much about kind of working hard, but heedful, careful, circumspect is a better word for that. So you are heedful, careful about what you're doing. You are trying to judge the world in the right way. Always trying to be as wise and mindful as you can be about this. So ardent, this means with energy or with a degree of effort. Resolute basically means the same thing. So if we are going to be heedful, and this idea of appamada is one of the root causes of the entire Buddhist path. If you go to the Anguttara once, the numerical discourses once, it has a large number of things that are considered the basis, the foundation for all spiritual practice. And appamada is one of those things. If you are pamada, if you are heedless, you're never going to go anywhere. Because it means you don't really care. You don't really circumspect. You don't really consider your existence or your life. And because you don't consider anything, you just kind of go on with the flow, and you do what everyone else does, and you never really get anywhere. So appamada is one of the core things that make the whole Buddhist practice possible. Another one is yoniso-manasikara, wise reflection. It's another one. Another one is kalyanamitta, having good spiritual friends. All of these things are kind of at the very foundation of this path. And maybe the most foundation of all may very well be appamada. because without that, you're not going to go anywhere. Yeah, so being appamada, he says here, as I abided, thus. Yeah, having appamada, being diligent. Well, what does that thus refer to? It refers to dividing your thoughts into two classes. That is what appamada means. To be heedful means that you understand you have to divide your thoughts into two classes. That's interesting, because what that means is that heedfulness very often has to do with how we reflect on the world, how we think about things, how we understand things, yeah? And actually just having that insight that your thoughts are either on the good side or the bad side, that itself is appamada, that itself is being heedful. Yeah, this is how you live a heedful life, by dividing your thinking into two classes. And this, of course, refers back to what we were talking about before, the idea of reflection, the power of reflection, paṭicca-samuppāda. And paṭicca-samuppāda, this is what this is, understanding things, understanding the world through this idea of appamada. So you divide your thoughts into two classes. And then it's easy on the surface, but actually doing that actually is quite difficult. And the reason why it is difficult is because thinking can also be very subtle. Yeah, I mean, we know, of course, that when you have kind of ill will, okay, you don't have understand obvious, you have some very strong desire, you know that there is desire. But these things can also be extraordinarily subtle. You can have a very tiny attachment to the body or to the five senses. Yeah, well, that is a negative thought, according to this. But it can be very, very hard to see. And you will notice this in your meditation. Yeah, you meditate, you become maybe peaceful. You may be really enjoying sitting here in this hall with good company or whatever, and you start to become really peaceful. And then you reach a plateau. It doesn't go any deeper. Why does it reach this plateau? And this is precisely the reason. You're attaching to something. There's some thought, there's some underlying thing, yeah, which is holding on to that sensory world. You can't let go of it. And sometimes that underlying thing comes out in the thinking mind. You think about these things, you reflect about these things. So this is why this insight into two classes of thought is very important, because it allows us to uncover the subtle defilements and the subtle attachments in the mind and block us from going deeper in meditation practice. So understanding these two classes of thought, it actually is quite difficult if you're going to take it all the way to the root, all the way to where you enter samadhi completely. And this is why it says, we're talking about the five hindrances. One of the five hindrances is doubt, right? Vichikicca is doubt. Now, what is that doubt? Well, that doubt is precisely not being able to understand and divide the wholesome from the unwholesome. This is how it is defined in the suttas. It doesn't mean doubt about how to go from here back to Tilorian Monastery if you're going to go there afterwards. It doesn't mean it is a very specific kind of doubt. And you will all notice that when you come to that meditation stagnates, and you don't know how to get deeper, that is that doubt. That is that vichikicca, where you haven't got the full understanding of your own mind and your own habits to enable you to carry forward. That is the problem, yeah? And only when you get to the jhana states, because then you have purified the mind of all of these unwholesome qualities. That is why it is said that vichikicca, doubt, has come to an end, because you know what the pure mind looks like. You know what is wholesome, what is unwholesome. You have made that division completely. So by practicing and understanding this division, by trying to understand our minds properly, we are moving towards samadhi states, towards jhana states. This practice will allow us eventually to get there. And when we get there, doubt will be gone. Yeah? So we are undermining doubt by investigating. In fact, this is one of the ways that doubt is abandoned in the sutta. This is how it is explicitly said. You investigate properly, you are careful, you look into your experiences, and you know what is wholesome, what is unwholesome in this way. So doubt can refer to your private inner qualities and states, etc. It can also refer to like textual things or religions, and what teachings maybe teaching is the right word, what teachings are wholesome and unwholesome. This word Dhamma in Pali is a very broad word that has two main meanings. One is teachings, and the other one is qualities. So you divide your thoughts into two classes. Yeah? And you set on one side the negative thoughts, thoughts of sensual desire, maybe sensory thoughts, thoughts about the world. This is very, very broad. It doesn't mean sensual in a narrow sense of kind of a sensual person who really is into enjoying the five senses. It means that this whole attachment to the world of the five senses. Almost everything we know. Yeah? The only time you come out of the world of the five senses is when you start to go deeper into your meditation and you leave the senses behind. The rest of the time we are immersed in that world. It's always around us. It's kind of very useful to remember what is meant by sensual desire. It is not a narrow thing, it's a very, very large, broad thing, the sensory world. So any thought about that, yeah, which is almost everything we think. How often do you think about jhana? How many times during the day do you think about jhana and deep samadhi? Not so often, right? So every time you don't think about jhana and deep samadhi, it's probably a sensory thought that has to do with the sensory world. Actually, that's not quite true. There are things when we think about kindness and generosity, and that is really already leading on to the spiritual path. But it is still, it's kind of in a gray zone. Yeah? It is still a little bit involved with the sensory world because this is where we do these actions, but it's also leaning towards spirituality. So it's kind of these things, when we think about being kind or doing something good or whatever, we're kind of in a more like a gray zone. Yeah, but pure spiritual thought, completely bereft or completely where you have left behind the world of the five senses completely, is kind of when you are, in daily life, you're all you're doing is you're kind of fantasizing about next time you're going to sit down and meditate because you love your meditation so much. That is the way, that's the way it should be. What usually happens is that when you meditate, you fantasize about the world of the five senses, but really it should be in daily life, we should fantasize about meditation. Yeah, that is kind of, you're on the right track here. Isn't that kind of cool? Imagine doing that. Yeah, you're kind of shopping. When am I going to sit down and meditate? Oh, I have to do all this and clean the house or whatever. This is why we have small kutis as Buddhist monastics, much less to clean. So kind of one of the advantages of monasticism, you minimize your spending time on all these other things. So this is the sensory thoughts, yeah, very, very broad area of thought. You understand that on one side, these are the unwholesome. I hesitate to use that word because the sensual places are not really bad as such. They're only bad with reference to a higher happiness. Yeah? That is why they're bad. They're bad because they block you from achieving deep meditation. That's why they're bad. But then in their own right, they are not, terrible things. You don't make a lot of bad karma by indulging in sensual pleasures. You get reborn as a human probably in the next life. That's really all it means. So it's not bad in that sense. It's bad more because they block you from achieving something higher. And it's also bad because they often tend, if you indulge too much in these things, they often bring with them other defilements that are far worse. As I will show you later on, if you live too entangled in the sensory world, it's impossible not to have ill will at times. It's impossible not to get upset, yeah, because that world inherently brings those negative defilements with it. And I will show this to you later. It's actually very interesting. It's very off-putting when you understand the connection between the sensory world and ill will and anger and all of these negative qualities of the mind. So then we have thoughts of ill will. These are angry thoughts. Yeah? And again, they can also be very, very refined. They can be just like a little bit of irritation in the mind or something like that. And all the way to kind of be completely irate and going crazy with anger now. And then the last one, which is kind of interesting here, is the thoughts of cruelty. And this is vihingsa. Let me have a look at what the part is. Either vihingsa, yeah, vihingsa, paṭicca. And You may recognize that word. It's very similar to the word that was used by Mahatma Gandhi. Yeah? Mahatma Gandhi in India, when he did his peaceful protest in India, it was the ahimsa movement. It's the same word, but the A in front makes it negative. It's non-cruelty. It's the kind of the compassionate movement. There's no harming going on. Yeah? The same word that he was used. One of the cool things about traveling to India is that you recognize all the words around you. Yeah, still the same language. It has changed, of course, but a lot of the words are still the same. And so you see these things. That's kind of really, again, it makes the suttas come alive when you realize that it is all connected to a living culture right here and right now. So, and these thoughts are vihingsa thoughts, are thoughts of harming, but there are also thoughts of not really caring about your consequences or how you deal with other people. Yeah. So if you are ruthless, for example, I love the word ruthless because ruthless means you don't care about how your actions affect others. It's not that you have ill will. It's not that you want to harm others, but in your business in the world and what you do in the world, if you happen to hurt others, you don't care about it. Yeah, if you drive your car and there's a kind of animal coming into the road, well, you have to get, if you hit that animal, you don't really care because you just don't, you have urgent business to do. You have to get on this retreat, yeah. So the animals, they have to kind of that's bad, right? That's really bad. If you want to go on the retreat, that's the last way you should think about things. So you have, instead of being ruthless, you are, what is the opposite of ruthless? Ruthful. You heard about the word ruthful? Very few people have heard about the word ruthful, but I discovered this when it was used back in the 18th century in England. It's the opposite of ruthless, because the word ruth means compassion. Yeah, the word ruth is a very common word in all of Northern Europe. All of Northern European countries have the name Ruth, and it's a woman's name. It means compassion. So ruthless means without compassion. Ruthful means having compassion. So thoughts of ruthlessness is one way of thinking about this. Or thought of being completely inconsiderate to other beings. Yeah? Thought of harming is acceptable. Cruelty is way too narrow to really capture the meaning of this word. And Bhikkhu has changed his translation of this later on, because I think maybe I was at some point that could have been me, because I work quite closely with him on some of his translations. So that is what is empty about. Yeah? So you have compassion to other beings. That lack of compassion itself is a bad quality, which is kind of fascinating. And on the other hand, you have thoughts of renunciation. What is a thought of renunciation? It means that you basically an understanding of the limits of the sensory realm. A mind that inclines toward giving up that world, inclines to meditation, inclines to wanting to sit down and be peaceful, inclines towards samadhi. That mind which inclines towards samadhi is a mind that renounces the world of the five senses. So if you have a thought of renunciation, it's precisely if your mind inclines towards those things. Finally get to sit down and think, wow, finally I can sit down. How wonderful. That is that kind of mind state. Thoughts of non-ill will, well, these are thoughts of metta. Yeah? Metta literally means friendliness. It comes from the word mitta, like kalyana mitta, which means friend. So this is like friendliness, called loving kindness in English, but friendliness is also an acceptable translation. So it is metta, but it's a bit more than just metta. And this is the reason why it is called non-ill will rather than metta. And it is also things like upekkha, where you become incredibly peaceful in meditation. You go beyond all ill will. You may not have any metta. In fact, you have gone beyond metta in one way. And so it is a bit broader than that. And that's why it's called non-ill will. But for practical reasons, you can think of it as friendliness or metta, the opposite of ill will. And then non-cruelty, of course, that is compassion then. Yeah? Again, a bit broader than compassion, but compassion is essentially what it is about. That gives an idea of the skillful set of thoughts that we should ideally cultivate on the Buddha's path. Yeah? Compassion, friendliness, I think friendliness to me is easy to understand, and loving kindness. Friendliness, compassion, and the idea of the mind being directed towards the peace of meditation. These are the three things. That gives you a very kind of clear idea of the kind of wholesome mind states in kind of daily life. Yeah? So, again, it is not enough. One thing we have to start, of course, by overcoming ill will and overcoming the negative thoughts. But we should also specifically develop these kind of thoughts in our daily life. As you do that, as you develop these things, that is where you kind of build up a barrier, a dike, something very powerful against those negative thoughts in the future. A mind that has been fully released through metta or through karuna, through compassion or friendliness, cannot give rise to these negative qualities anymore. The more powerful that metta is in your daily life, the less likely it is that these negative thoughts will arise. You're building up a barrier, you're building up something very strong that actually blocks you from having these experiences. It is almost like we have this freight train or this super tanker. Yeah, you may have seen these really large cargo ships, enormous ships that some of them are almost half a kilometer long. They kind of carry, I don't know how many thousands of tons of oil or whatever cargo they can carry. It takes a long, long time for those ships, when they reach maximum speed, they don't go super fast, they go surprisingly fast for these enormous ships. But for that ship to change its course, it takes a long time. It takes many, many kilometers to change its course because the momentum is so high. So, but gradually, it changes its course. And we are a bit like super tankers. Our mind are very heavily conditioned by the past, by our habits. And it's difficult to change these things. It's not difficult in the sense of mathematics is difficult, but it's difficult in the sense that it takes perseverance to change the course of your mind and change those habits. But if you keep on doing it, it will happen. And you start to feel it happening. Yeah? The course is moving, it's changing. You can feel that the momentum of bad habits of the past is no longer as strong as it used to be. It's extraordinarily encouraging when that happens. You think, wow, this really is working. It is possible to change your mind. Your mind is not stuck into some kind of negative pattern forever after. Actually, you can change your mind. And this is a very important point, because one of the problems of the sense of self that almost everyone carries with them, the problem with that sense of self is that it feels like we are stuck with what we have. This is me. Yeah, there is a limit to your ability to imagine the kind of change that is possible, because the sense of self blocks you from being able to see that change. Because sense of self means that I am. This is who I am. This is my person. Yeah. So you can't really understand this. But really, it's very important to have faith. Actually, the mind can be changed. And this is what we're doing here. So exactly what we're trying to do. We're changing this kind of super tanker of our mind, has this tremendous momentum from the past. Slowly. And as you keep going, yeah, you can feel it turns around. And one day you will be going in exactly the opposite direction. Instead of ill will being the kind of basic factor that arises when certain people behave in a certain way. I don't know if anyone here has road rage, but kind of getting angry on the road, very, very common, right? Because people do all kind of things on the road, which they probably shouldn't be doing. But so if you don't get that anger when someone does something dodgy on the road, well, it means you're doing really, really well. That's a difficult one, yeah, when you're driving on the road. These are kind of the little things. I remember one of my colleagues in Perth, he was a monk for a while, not a monk anymore, but he said when he drives in traffic, he always plays some kind of metta chant or something like that when he drives. Or at the very least, he plays a Dhamma talk to remind them, okay, this is not, don't get angry, even if someone kind of jumps in ahead of you or whatever, and you still kind of, you stay cool and you have compassion or whatever. So we have we all have these areas in life where we tend to get triggered. Triggered is kind of modern word, meaning you kind of, you react, basically, that's what it means. It's a reaction. So you get triggered or you react. And if you start to see, you don't get triggered anymore, you don't react anymore to things that used to have a very powerful effect on you. you know that something is happening within you. You're seeing things in a new way. Family members are some of the most difficult people not to be triggered by. Isn't that true? You come back, and I visit my mother. I'm going back to my mother now, and I'm bracing myself to what's going to happen. She's old, and I'm still her son, right? So she's still going to probably, maybe she's not going to treat me. I could actually see her. Things have changed a little bit, but still, there is those ancient habits deep down there somewhere. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens when I meet. It probably will be all right, but I'm just kind of saying this for them because this is how it is very often. So if you're able to change your reactions to your family members and see them in a different way, well, that is really shows that you are doing really, really well. Some of the most difficult things to do because the habits are so incredibly ingrained. You see a husband and wife who've been married for 50 years. I just remember my own parents, and I thought, wow, sometimes the things the habits are so silly sometimes, and I kind of marvel, and you kind of. I find that even though my parents are very good parents and they were married for the whole life, they had a good marriage, still there are things in there which kind of, I thought, I don't really want to, that's not what I want to do. That's kind of terrible. Do I want to be exactly like my parents? Not really. Am I going to be exactly like my parents if I end up in a partnership with somebody, if I get married or whatever? Am I going to be like my parents? The chances are I will be exactly like them. This is how things usually are. This is kind of the conceit that I will be different. My relationship will be, no, it won't be different at all. It will be exactly the same. Look at your parents, you know where you're going. Okay, I'm going to be a monk instead. That's the kind of thing I was thinking of. And I looked at my brother and sister as well. I looked at the kind of relationships they got into. And I thought, no way, I'm heading a different direction. And I don't know. Of course, I'm not discouraging. If you are in a relationship, make the best of it, Because if you have a spiritual practice, of course, you can do something with the relationship that most people cannot. So I don't want to talk down relationships in general. If you have a good one and it's working well and you can use it for a spiritual path, please use it that way. But as a monastic, I'm almost duty bound to see the downside of relationships. It's kind of par for the course for the monastics. Okay, so this is the Buddha has done. He has set the thoughts into two classes. Didn't get very far, 1 hour has disappeared. Oh well, this is usually often what happens on this. But I don't know, I find some of these things very interesting. So I want to bring some of these things out. The purpose of a course like this, to my mind, is to gain a deeper appreciation of the Buddhist teachings. And hopefully it will help you not just now, but in the long run, to practice in a good way. So for that reason, I spent a bit of time in going into some of the details. But the crux, the main part of the sutta, is actually coming up now, really. And so I guess we'll just postpone that till this afternoon. We're going to talk about how precisely to deal with those negative thoughts and how to turn the mind, how to turn the super-tanker around. In the meantime, I wish you all a very nice lunch. Please have a nice afternoon with a nice meditation. What is the contemplation happening? Thursday or 2 days, okay. Yeah. Okay. Of course you can. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So that's it. So, and then we'll carry on with the meditation a little bit at 2 o'clock, and then 6 o'clock this evening we will continue this class. How did the dependent origination chanting go this morning? Did it go okay? Yes, it was successful. Okay, good. So that's great. So that's what dependent origination sounds like in Pali. Now you know. It's kind of handy.
But we don't have a printer or copier here.
That's a good idea, otherwise it gets very, very hard to chant this. There is actually partially in there, but anyway. Okay, everyone.